You've already lost the moment you start explaining yourself, and the other person just leans back slightly, tilts their head, and says nothing. Because silence, strategic, deliberate silence, is the first weapon of control, and powerful people use it not to communicate but to dominate the space between words, forcing you to fill it, exposing more than you planned, revealing insecurity through unnecessary detail while they remain still, composed, watching your eyes flicker, your posture shift, your voice tighten just enough to signal that you're now reacting instead of leading, and that's the shift most people never notice. The moment the conversation stops being mutual and becomes directional, guided not by who is speaking more, but by who is controlling the emotional rhythm beneath the words. And once that rhythm is captured, they begin to slow everything down, not randomly, but precisely, stretching responses just enough to create pressure, because humans are wired to seek resolution, to close loops, to avoid discomfort. So when someone delays their reply, holds eye contact a second too long, or pauses mid-sentence, as if choosing their words with surgical care, your brain starts working harder to interpret meaning, and in that effort, you unconsciously assign them higher authority, assuming depth where there may only be strategy. And suddenly you're leaning forward, listening more carefully, adjusting your tone to match theirs, without realizing that you've already stepped into their frame, and from that point on, you're no longer having a conversation. You're adapting to one. Then comes the subtle redirection, the moment they don't answer your question directly, but instead reshape it, slightly twisting the angle so that the focus shifts from what you asked to what they want to address. And it happens so smoothly that you don't resist it, because it feels like progression, like the conversation is moving forward, when in reality it's being rerouted. And powerful people do this constantly, not by interrupting aggressively, but by reframing gently, using phrases that sound cooperative but function as control mechanisms, guiding the topic away from uncomfortable territory and into areas where they hold advantage. And if you're not paying attention, you'll find yourself agreeing to a premise you never intended to accept. What makes this even more effective is their control over emotional intensity, because they never match your energy. They regulate it. And this is where most people lose without realizing it, because when you raise your voice slightly, they lower theirs. When you become more expressive, they become more still, creating a contrast that positions them as composed and you as reactive. And in social dynamics, perception of control often matters more than actual logic. So even if your argument is stronger, their calm delivery reframes the entire interaction, making you appear unstable. And once that perception is established, everything you say after gets filtered through it, weakening your position before you even finish your sentence. But the real manipulation begins when they start using selective validation, giving you just enough agreement to keep you engaged, but never enough to give you full confidence, because full confidence would make you independent, and independence breaks control. So instead, they nod occasionally, acknowledge small points, mirror certain phrases you use, creating the illusion of alignment while subtly maintaining distance. And this keeps you talking, keeps you trying to win them over, keeps you investing more into the interaction than they are. And the more you invest, the harder it becomes to pull back, because now your ego is involved. And once ego enters the conversation, objectivity disappears. Watch closely how they handle challenges, because powerful people rarely confront directly unless they're certain of dominance. Instead, they use questions, not to understand, but to destabilize, asking things like, "Why do you think that?" or "What makes you so sure?" Not out of curiosity, but to shift the burden of proof onto you, forcing you into a defensive position where you have to justify your stance, and while you're busy explaining, they remain neutral, untouched, observing. And this asymmetry creates an imbalance of effort, where you're working harder to maintain your position than they are to challenge it. And over time, that imbalance erodes your confidence, making their perspective feel stronger simply because it required less effort to maintain. There's also the strategic use of ambiguity, where they say just enough to imply meaning, but not enough to be held accountable for it, leaving room for interpretation. And this is dangerous because your mind will naturally fill in the gaps, often projecting your own assumptions onto their words. And once you've done that, you're no longer responding to what they actually said. but to what you think they meant, and that gives them power because they can always adjust their position later, claiming you misunderstood while still benefiting from the emotional impact of the implication. And this keeps them flexible while keeping you anchored to a specific interpretation. At a certain point, they introduce subtle contradictions, not obvious enough to trigger resistance, but just enough to create confusion, because confusion weakens resistance. And when your brain is trying to reconcile conflicting information, it becomes more suggestible, more open to external guidance. And that's when they offer clarity, but only after you've experienced uncertainty, positioning themselves as the source of resolution. And this creates a psychological dependency, where you start associating them with answers, with direction, with stability, even though they were the ones who introduced the instability in the first place. Somewhere in the middle of all this, you might notice your body reacting before your mind does. A slight tightening in your chest, a hesitation before speaking, a subtle shift in posture as you adjust yourself to match their presence. And these micro-reactions are signals that control has already been established. Because control isn't just about words, it's about state, about who is influencing whose internal environment. And powerful people understand this at an instinctive level, managing not just what is said, but how it feels to be in the conversation, shaping the atmosphere in a way that keeps them centered and you slightly off balance. And just when you think you've regained footing, they introduce scarcity, pulling back their attention, shortening responses, breaking eye contact at strategic moments, making you feel like their focus is limited, valuable, something you have to earn. And this triggers a deeper instinct, because humans are drawn to what feels scarce, what seems just out of reach. And now you're not just participating in the conversation. You're trying to hold their attention, trying to keep them engaged, which flips the dynamic completely, turning you into the one seeking approval without ever being directly asked to do so. If you've ever walked away from a conversation replaying it in your head, wondering why you said certain things, why you agreed to points you didn't fully believe in, why you felt slightly drained or unsettled without a clear reason. This is why, because the control was never obvious, it was embedded in timing, in tone, in structure, in the invisible layers beneath the surface. And once you see it, you realize that most conversations aren't equal exchanges. They're subtle negotiations of power, where one person is guiding and the other is adjusting. Make sure to like, comment, and share Modern Intelligence for such insight, not because it's a routine call to action, but because recognizing these patterns changes how you move through every interaction, how you interpret silence, how you respond to questions, how you hold your ground without over-explaining, and once you internalize this, you stop reacting automatically and start choosing deliberately, which is where real control begins. The shift happens when you stop trying to be understood and start observing what is being controlled, when you notice the pauses, the reframes, the subtle emotional calibrations, and instead of filling silence, you let it exist. Instead of defending immediately, you question the premise. Instead of matching their rhythm, you disrupt it. Because control isn't about overpowering the other person. It's about refusing to be unconsciously guided. And the moment you break that pattern, the dynamic changes, often instantly, because most people rely on others staying unaware. And when awareness enters the equation, their strategies lose effectiveness. And that's the final layer most people never reach. The realization that power in conversation isn't loud, it isn't aggressive, it isn't even obvious, it's quiet, controlled, almost invisible, operating beneath the surface, shaping outcomes without drawing attention to itself. And once you see it clearly, you can't unsee it. You start recognizing it everywhere, in meetings, in relationships, in casual interactions that suddenly feel less casual. And in that awareness, something shifts inside you, not externally dramatic, but internally precise, like a recalibration of how you perceive every exchange. Because now, you're not just listening to words, you're reading intent. You're not just speaking, you're choosing when and how to engage, and that changes everything, because control was never about dominating others, it was about not being dominated without realizing it. And once that line becomes clear, you step into a different level of interaction entirely, one where silence is no longer uncomfortable, where questions are no longer traps, where attention is no longer something you chase, but something you direct. Now that you understand this, Watch this next video on control.